Welcome to the Impactus podcast. I'm Dean Brenton, and we are here to equip you as men for a life of purpose and godly impact. With so many Canadian young adults leaving the faith by the time they leave home, is there anything that we can do as parents to ensure faith transmission to the next generation? How can parents disciple their children effectively in the home, and what kinds of things can parents do to their best to pass on faith to the next generation? You know, these are critical questions that need careful answers. Parenting is both rewarding and challenging. But beyond passing on life skills, we have a vital responsibility to educate our children, care for their social development, and also bring them up in the faith. The Canadian Evangelical Family Faith Formation Study began in 2019 as an initiative of the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, along with 15 other ministry partners. And Impactus Promise Keepers Canada was one of those partners who participated in a research project investigating how Canadian evangelical parents and guardians understand their roles as disciple makers of their children and what they do to form their children's faith at home. It draws on findings from interviews with parents and family ministry experts and a survey with over 1,000 evangelical parents in Canada. I'm really delighted today to have two of the key research team members with us to talk about their findings and their implications for Christian parents. So today we have Lindsay Callaway with us. She has been with the EFC since 2019 and works as a researcher for the Center for Research on Church and Faith. She's contributed to the Parenting Faith Study, the Significant Church Study, and the Faith Trends podcast, where she's a co-host. Lindsay has a graduate degree in systematic theology from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and bioethics from Trinity International University. And she lives in Ottawa with her husband, who is a pastor, and their 3 children. Rick Hiemstra is also with us, and he's the director of the EFC's Center for Research on Church and Faith. Prior to coming to the EFC, he served as a Wesleyan pastor and a high school mathematics and computer science teacher. He speaks on Canadian church and cultural trends, including the Parenting Faith, Significant Church, and renegotiating faith studies. He's recently contributed to the Canadian Studies on Bible Engagement, Local Church Missions Engagement, Small Evangelical Churches, and Emerging Adulthood and Faith Formation. He holds a BMath from the University of Waterloo, a BEd from University of Ottawa, and an MTS from Tyndale Seminary. You know, it's a privilege to be able to bring you this kind of solid biblical and practical content through the podcast. And I want you to challenge you, if you know a young guy who could use this kind of resource, please invite them to check out our Young Men's podcast as well. We'd also be grateful if you would subscribe and share our podcast and leave us a review on the platform you use, not for us, but to get more people to experience this content. And lastly, if you'd like to support the work of this ministry and these podcasts, please head over to impactus.org/give and consider becoming a monthly partner or making a one-time donation to help us continue this vision to see every man become, grow, and live as a disciple of Jesus. So let's get into today's episode. Well, welcome to the Impactus podcast. We're privileged to have Lindsay Callaway and Rick Hiemstra with us today. Thank you both for joining us. It's so good to have you with us to talk about a really important study that you've done.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thanks, Dean.
Oh, it's good. Let's dive right in. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your family, and kind of what led you to the work at EFC and maybe this study. Lindsay, start with you.
Sure. Well, I've been with EFC for almost 4 years now, and I just really wanted to be in a role where I would be able to serve the church. And so in this research role, we do ministry research. So we're answering questions that our affiliates, ministry organizations, schools, pastors, and leaders in denominations that they bring to us. And we try to answer those questions. So coming at this from a real church-oriented perspective, personally, I'm a pastor's wife, and I live in Ottawa, and we have 3 children, and they're 5, 4, and 1. So we're still pretty new at the parenting thing.
Fantastic. Rick, how about yourself?
I've been in this role with the EFC studying the church in Canada since 2007. Before that, I pastored a small church in Cornwall, Ontario. We have 4 kids, and the youngest is 16 and the oldest is 23. So we're a little bit further along in that journey than Lindsay and her family. But I'm very glad to be able to do this kind of research serving the church.
That's wonderful. And Rick, you and I have connected a few times at different events around the country. And so I've gotten to know you and some of the work you've done. And this one is of particular interest to us as a ministry, but me as well. I'm a dad of 4 girls. I'm a little further down the road than you both. Our youngest is 19 and our oldest is 27. But, this study really piqued my interest. And I was a late adopter to this conversation because it had started before I had begun in this role. But when I stepped into this and into the middle of the conversation, it was very intriguing where this was going and what the findings might produce. So tell me a little bit about what led to starting this study on faith formation that became the Parenting Faith Study. Rick, you can jump in if you'd like.
Yeah, so this goes all the way back to 2019. There was a consultation that was held, and I think maybe as many as 30 different ministry organizations met at Muskoka Bible Center. And the big question was, how can we support parents as they disciple their kids in the home? As we had this conversation, one of the things that we realized is that we have lots of ministry organizations producing great resources. And at one point in the conversation, we were looking at this list just growing and growing. And we thought, well, then why doesn't it seem parents are using them? And so this launched a research study. About 17 organizations, including Impactus, were part of it. And we're just looking at this question about how can we support parents as they disciple kids in the home.
Lindsay, what were some of the factors that drew you into this conversation as well?
Well, what's interesting is, I was hired. Coming at this as a parent, as a member of the church, there's lots of different factors as a researcher that are interesting. And I think we're all concerned about the next generation, or how are we effectively passing our faith on. And a lot of this came in reaction to trends that we're seeing among young adults that some of the other EFC studies will speak into, especially renegotiating faith, which is about young adults and how they've adopted their faith sort of after leaving home. And so seeing some of the concerning trends, it led people to think, well, what's happening at home? And how are we shaping and forming children and preparing them for an adulthood of following Jesus? And is there a disconnect there? So there's an opportunity to be able to look at some of the trends at what is happening at home in order to help build a resilient faith in our youth and into adulthood.
I was a youth pastor at the time when the hemorrhaging faith studies began to come out. And what I liked about this one, it just went deeper into the younger kids and how parents could really shape and form their families and transmit their faith. What were some of the other trends that you would have observed about how parents have passed on their faith to their children?
So we expect some things. We expect modeling, we expect teaching, and that's what our respondents said. That's what faith formation involves, is modeling and teaching the faith. But we did see some things that we weren't expecting, and it was this intentional parenting in a different way than how you were raised. So the parents said, there were some things in my childhood that I didn't want, and I don't want to do that with my kids. And it was this idea of unquestioning obedience and lack of explanation for matters of faith. And so we saw teaching and modeling emerge as themes, but more in reaction to their upbringings. Teaching is an emphasis that combats that lack of explanation. But then we also saw this emphasis on choice to combat that idea of rigid obedience. And there are, a few challenges I'm sure that you can think of and implications, but if you emphasize choice, it deprioritizes the faith and it becomes one option among many. And then we're not explaining to our children why this is the best choice. This is the way of Christ, is the way of life. And so that tends to be lacking. There's already research showing that when parents emphasize choice, it usually leads to their children disaffiliating with the faith of their childhood.
I found that piece particularly fascinating. The de-emphasizing of that rigidity and passing on that obedience, but the highlighting and the emphasizing of choice. Like, that was really fascinating. That change. Rick, anything that you'd like to add to that?
Well, I think it changes the parental role and how parents understand what they're doing. If you're providing your kids choices, what you do is and this is the language that parents used in the interviews, you would expose your kids to different religious choices. And so if your role is a choice provider, then the gift that you're giving your kids is the gift of choices. And for choice to be meaningful, then you have to have several choices. And so, what parents would do is they would then, because they didn't want to put their thumb on the scales in favor of Christianity in the home, they would take their kids to church to be exposed to Christianity. So that's one of the jobs they see at the church. And then they would want their kids to be exposed to other religions, either in the public school system or in other places in the community. But this is very different in terms of how you understand your role. And therefore, you're not making strong arguments necessarily for the Christian faith, but you're providing this choice. And this goes back, Dean, to something called the authentic self. And I'm referencing, this is the language of Charles Taylor. He's a Canadian philosopher. He's been very important in some public debates in Quebec. And this is kind of what's behind this. And I don't know, can we take just a few minutes to kind of unpack this a little bit?
Absolutely.
So what Taylor says is that way back when we're going back to Rousseau, when in Europe, where they were dealing with corruption in government, in this case, it would be kings, and in the church, people set out to say, well, how do we deal with this? And what they said is that they were going to reimagine what a human being is. And so they would say that I am good until society makes me bad. And if you think about this, if everybody else is bad, and then what's left that's good? Well, it's me that's good. And so what you do is you say that the only true authority is myself, and then you move what Sam Reimer calls the locus of authority inside. So fast forward over many years, and there's a lot of different reasons why it took so long for this to become kind of a dominant idea in our culture. But Taylor says that when we go to think about ourselves, there is who I am, but then there's who I really am. And who I really am is this deep part of myself. We describe it with this deep language. It's deep down inside. There's who I am. And that's the authentic self. And so Taylor says that what's important here is that you have to discover it yourself. So other people can't help you, and that what you find is going to be unique. And so what this means as we sort of internalize this through the culture is that the parents don't have anything to sort of feed into this. My youth pastor doesn't. The Bible doesn't, because I can only truly find my authentic self if I do it myself. Now, the reason that it's so important that you find your authentic self is Taylor says that this is moral salvation. And we're using language that we're very familiar with in the church. And this is redefining what the religious quest is. The religious quest is not to be reconnected with God because of the break that sin has worked in that relationship, but it's to connect me with the deeper me. And so if you have to do this yourself in order to be sure that it's you, then others can't help you with that. And so parents to intrude and to present Jesus strongly essentially is de-saving their children. Now, the other part about this is that we expect in this thing of authentic self that if you look deep down inside, what you're going to find will be unique. And so if you believe in Jesus and I believe in Jesus, if I look and see, well, it looks sort of like what Dean believes, then I found Dean's faith. And when we think about our faith as it's a real deep part of ourselves. And so there's this tendency to say that our faith has to be unique, right? And so we say things like our kids have to find their faith for themselves, their own faith. And what we mean there, and there's a couple different meanings. We mean that they have to own it for themselves, make it their own. But increasingly we mean that they have to craft a faith that is their own and that it's different from everybody else's. And so parents become really reticent to pass on the faith once delivered to the kids because they feel like when they're doing that they're actually cutting their kids off from their authentic self and the salvation that our culture understands that to be.
As I listen to that, the implications are seismic for parents and for the church, even as we look at Canadian culture and the emphasis around freedom and rights and all associated, with my individuality and my autonomy. And that filters into how we must process, I think, how we now will have to translate or transmit faith to our children. So let me push a little deeper then. How have you seen the difference between how men and women are involved in the passing of faith on to their children through the study?
What's interesting about that question is, we didn't ask about different roles. We didn't ask, what do you do as a mom? What do you do as a dad? But we simply asked, how is the way that you form the faith of your children different than, say, your spouse's? But it often went to some distinctives. And we saw that men tended to pass the faith on in these episodic teaching times. So something that had a clear goal or had a clear start and beginning, and it was very teaching oriented. Whereas women tended to integrate faith formation through conversations throughout the day and generally around certain routines like at bedtime or around the table. And so if you were to kind of put it into a metaphor, I would say men were teaching a class on faith and women tended to teach through a culture of faith. And so those are some of the differences. And it's neither good nor bad, but I think that if you want to reinforce the faith in as many ways as possible, then we should try to be modeling and teaching, holding those two together in as many of those models in children's lives as possible. So you want to be, we don't want to communicate to children that faith is just for 6:30 to 7 on a weeknight after dinner. Faith is integrated throughout the whole day, and it's something that impacts our whole lives, and it matters to the way we live. And so I think it's important to just reinforce the faith as many times throughout the day as possible from as many adults in those children's lives. And that can include mentors in the church or grandparents. There's a lot of opportunities for adults to speak into children's lives. And another thing that we saw lacking was actually skills development. Something like not only that we should pray or that my parents pray and I participate, but actually inviting children to pray themselves, or learning not just that we should read the Bible or how to read the Bible, but how to interpret the Bible, and what it says about God and what that means for how I live in light of that. So things like that, we did see missing when there was an emphasis on just maybe more of a modeling faith or a conversational faith. We did see these religious skills missing.
Wow, that's fascinating. Rick, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, one of the verses that people brought up really frequently was from Deuteronomy 6, and where it talks about when you teach your kids when you get up, when you walk along the way, and it's the sort of integrated into your day kind of teaching, and I think that there's real wisdom in this. Anybody who's learned a second language, and many of us in Canada who in English speaking Canada have learned French, in school. And what you will find is that there's only a certain level you can get to unless you can start to speak in a conversation. And conversation is just a way that we process things more deeply. And what you have presented in Deuteronomy chapter 6 is parents having this ongoing conversation throughout their day. And it is in that ability to talk about what they're experiencing, and as they talk about what they're experiencing, that's where faith really starts to solidify and go deep.
It's interesting, and I think there's implications. Obviously, our audience is focused on men and guys and dads. If guys could tend away from the conversational piece and treat more faith transmission as more of an event or a teaching moment, they may miss some of those conversational moments that could, and thankfully, I think in a healthy situation, you can have both at play. But I think there's a challenge in there for dads, not to just to treat it as we're going to do family devotions at this moment, and miss the conversational moments throughout the day, on the drive, at the coffee shop, at the sports field, whatever. That could be really fascinating and really help, I think, the transmission of faith. How do parents know if faith formation is successful?
Well, we expect children to take on the faith of their parents. And so we look, we can't know the heart, but we look to children adopting the beliefs and behaviors of their parents. And so as researchers, it's hard to really measure beliefs, and we didn't interview children. So we looked at behaviors, and we looked to see if what the parents did was replicated in their children, especially as they aged. And so we asked about 17 what we called faith formation activities, but they were really just sort of faith activities that you might do at home. It included praying at dinner, praying apart from meals, reading the Bible, doing a devotional, journaling, listening to Christian worship music, things like that. And these ideas, we didn't just come up with them on our own. We had interviewed many parents, and we just assembled a list of what they said that they did at home. And then we put that in the survey and asked over 1,000 parents, what are you doing and what are your kids doing? And in the report, I'm sure you've seen this, Dean, there might be some mind-boggling graphs of just what especially children were doing at home in participation with these faith activities. And so there were some things where we saw some, we'll see it, the faith activity would grow with the age of literacy. So as children are able to read, then they're able to interact with the Bible and read the Bible. As children are able to speak, then we see a little bit more conversational growth. But I think what was disheartening was that we didn't see the parents' level of activities. We didn't see teens coming to meet or even approach the level of the parents' participation in these activities. And so there's quite a bit of a gap in at least the transmission of behaviors. And that's what is going to lead us to ask some more questions.
In fact, if you looked at these faith formation activities as a whole, I think we would say that kids' participation in them seems to peak around age 9 or 10. And then there's a gradual decline into the teenage years for most of them, if we looked at this as a whole. I should mention that when we did our survey, that we surveyed 1,217 parents, and they represented 3,041 children. So we have a robust sample in order to track these differences by children's age.
I'm suspecting that as some parents, dads, moms are hearing this conversation, they're approaching the conversation from probably deficiency in their thinking of we're not doing enough, we're not doing it well enough. What have you, or what do you think? Why do you think parents feel unprepared to engage this faith transmission conversation to really grow faith in their children?
I think there's a degree to which they think they're having to do it alone. we see that they're parenting differently than how they were raised, even among people who shared the same faith as their parents. And we asked parents, where are you going to for help in faith formation? And a lot of them said their friends, and friends are great and they're good, but friends are really there to walk beside you, and they can't always give you the wisdom of somebody who's walked ahead of you. And then they often go to things like social media, to books, to podcasts. And again, these might have a wealth of information and help, but you're processing that alone. Oftentimes you're in your car, or you're listening through headphones, and then if you hear something that you don't like, you can close the book, you can turn it off, you can unfollow. There's so many things that just maybe push parents and inundate them with information and maybe help, but there isn't opportunity to process that in the context of relationships or the church. And the church was really, I think, a key missing piece in the conversations we had with parents. The church seemed to exist for individual and social reasons. It was there to build up my child for their individual edification, but there wasn't much talk about, this community of faith and pursuing Jesus as fellow disciples. And so I think parents have maybe feel cut off or isolated, and there is a wealth of relationships that do take intentionality and time, but I think it's a real grace. And we know that from Ephesians, the church is there to serve and to equip, and parents can access that. It shouldn't be a burden. And I think it will really, I think that's one of the keys there.
Even when we asked parents about how their churches were equipping them to disciple their kids, it was almost as if they didn't understand what we were asking, because they would answer and say things like, well, we have a youth group for our kids and Sunday school. But the idea that the church would be equipping them as disciplers for their kids, it almost didn't compute. And so very rarely did anyone that we interviewed say that, our church offered a course, or they offered this kind of mentoring for us as parents. And, there's all kinds of reasons why that might be, but certainly there is room for churches to step into that equipping role, and ministries like Impactus.
Absolutely. I see a great responsibility both on the church and parents for parents to make sure their families are part of a community of faith, but a responsibility, and I'm come from a pastoral background, to ensure that we are building true communities of faith and involving our the different skills and giftings and personalities in our congregations and ministry programs. So there's a great responsibility, but a great opportunity right now, I think, for churches and parents to engage this and find strength in each other. Rick, let me throw this one back to you, but how can fathers take a more active role in faith development? And Lindsay, I'm not going to preclude you from this either, but I'll start with Rick since he's a dad in this one.
I think it's the conversation piece. So here's the thing, that in the way that many households are structured, right? Usually in more houses than not, the dads are out working, which takes them out of the household for, at least 8 hours a day. Probably you add in commuting, that's 10 hours a day. And there is just less opportunity for conversation. Now, this is changing as more and more moms work outside of the home as well. But what we have to be conscious of is that when we're not present to our kids, we're also not present to have those faith conversations with them. And we need to be intentional about that. One of the things that we found is that it is in the transitions in kids' days that you have the opportunity to have these conversations, because they're coming from one activity and they're processing what they've just experienced. That is the place to plug in and to talk about what happened in light of their faith. Maybe they had a fight at school. Now we're going to talk about what Christ says about loving your enemies, right? And, kids' enemies, in many ways it's trite, but it's very real for them. And how do you help them process what maybe they experienced at school? Because this is when this information is fresh. And if you can step into those conversations as they happen, then you've got their attention because they're in transition from one thing. They were giving their attention to the previous thing. They're going to give their attention to something else. But right now, as you're walking home with them from school or as you're driving them to something else, you have this precious bit of time to talk about their faith. Mm-hmm. And it is the conversations again in which people process their faith and where it starts to become deep.
That's good. Lindsay, any thoughts?
Well, far be it from me to be really directive in this area, but I can point you to the research. And we did see a trend, especially in our interviews, that insofar as the husband participates, especially at church, the family will follow. And so in a few cases where the husbands were not active in church life, it had a great deal of impact, especially on the wives, but also on the children. And so when the dad is invested and plugged in at the church, that's going to have a ripple effect in the rest of the family. And so there's great opportunity there. Dads don't have to know what to say, to speak into every, to teach a class on everything. But if he's showing that he's willing to learn in a church context, the family will also follow the rest of the family. And that's a trend we saw, and something that I think would really affect families for the better.
And your kids are going to love what you love. And so, Scripture directs us to keep a watch on ourselves. And so sometimes there's a real place for self-reflection. What do I love? And my kids will pick up what I love. I don't have to announce it to them. And so if you love Christ, if you love the church, your kids are going to see that. They have free will. They're going to make some of their own choices. And that doesn't guarantee that they're going to follow Christ. But you will be directing them that way because they will follow the direction of your love.
Oh, that's good. I hope every dad has heard that challenge, that there is a ripple effect by your involvement and engagement in your own faith. And we've seen studies in the past, and it's just interesting that it's still relevant today. So as parents, and not just as researchers in this thing, but how did you find this the study challenging and interesting for yourselves? Like, what stood out to you personally? Lindsay, you start.
Sure. Well, I work from home and I work part-time, so I'm at home a lot. And I've just been really encouraged to lean into just the mundane moments. It's not about doing something extravagant or special all the time, but just being able to share about my faith with my children in very ordinary ways, and to really embrace those opportunities, because I have many opportunities just because of the nature of my work and where I'm situated. And so, and there are times when I can't always talk to my children, but I can model my faith for them and then follow up on that. And so this study has really just encouraged me to not focus on one or the other. And then again, like I said, to invite my children to participate, to help them build the skills, to actually build this resilient faith. So inviting them to read and asking them, what do you think that means? And, how does that affect how we live? And it's really just been, I don't do it perfectly, obviously. I don't think any of us do, but it's encouraged me to take advantage of the moments that I have that are ordinary.
That's really good. Rick, how about yourself? Well, I've worked as a pastor, and I've worked in this research position for a number of years now. And, as Lindsay and I have talked, and we've talked with others, I've just reflected on my time, and there's a certain amount of regret that I haven't either spent more time or taken or made the time to spend with my kids. Because, ministry is a very demanding job. And even, we talked with some pastors' kids and missionaries' kids in our research. And sadly, most of them said, you know what, my parents gave attention to the church, but they didn't give attention to me. And, I look back and I wonder about what I missed. And, I try intentionally now to make sure that, I take my kids one-on-one. We have a family of four kids, and it's hard to get that one-on-one time unless you're intentional about it. So, we have a Tim Hortons that's about 20 minutes away. I try and corral them, one at a time. Want to come to Tim Hortons with me? I'll buy you something, right? But what I'm looking for is the time to talk with them one-on-one. And, so, it's both challenging for me as I look at this, but I realize that God is not done with our kids. God is not done with our relationship with our kids. And there is place to improve those relationships and the relationships in your church. But it's going to take some intentionality. And we're going to have to recognize, I think, at its core that you have to make space for these conversations about Christ, about the place of the church, about what your faith means in your life in all of these places where you're going to find yourself.
I've asked those same questions many times, with a ministry background. What have I missed, and the opportunities that just have kind of passed by. And as parents, isn't it, classic that we'll go, well, when we get out of this stage, things will get better. And they actually just change. They don't, it never gets easier. And when I look back now, I miss those moments. And I think you're right, Rick. And, there's always moments, we can have some regrets about the past, but we can always look forward to opportunities because God is not done. He's always going to help us and be shaping our children. He loves them actually he does more than we love them, and he cares for them and has a purpose for them. And so thanks for being vulnerable with that and just sharing where you are. And it just resonates for me, and I know it'll resonate for many of our hearers. Boil it down, Rick and Lindsay, to if you were to leave one key thing for parents who are listening, take away from this study, if you can boil it down to one, what would you leave with them with this, with your research?
I would just say that the church is there for you, and they need you just as much as you need them. So you don't have to do it alone. Go to the church. That's
good. Good. Rick?
I would just encourage parents to be bold to share Christ with their kids. There is all kinds of cultural pressure to back off. But Jesus is good news. He's good news. He was good news 2,000 years ago. He's good news today. And, we are so happy to share life hacks with our kids. I think we need to be at least as enthusiastic about sharing Jesus.
I love that. It's such a great opportunity that we have with all the disconnection that's happened over the past few years. And we'll use words like deconstruction of faith. Like we have such an opportunity. We can look at the negative, or we can say, you know what, we have an opportunity to have conversation again, to walk with their children in the morning, in the afternoon, in the evenings, and just transmit faith, like letting it rub off on us, the authentic faith, hopefully that we have, would just resonate and take root in the lives of our children. Where can our viewers go to access the study and to learn more about your work at the EFC?
Well, you can find the study at parentingfaith.ca. So that's a website, parentingfaith.ca. It's a free PDF download. And you could contact either of us at research@thefc.ca. So that's research@thefc.ca.
Fantastic. Well, I want to thank you both for joining this conversation today, because it is such an important survey and study, and the implications, I believe, can serve the church and parents for years to come if we'll dive into what's happening, what we can do about it, and how we can transmit our faith on a very practical way. And so thank you for the work that you do at the EFC, but also just the passion that you put into this project, because it is so needed, and I believe it's going to have huge impact in the future. So thank you both for your work, and thank you for joining us today on the Impactus podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for listening to the Impactus podcast. To learn more about living a life of purpose and godly impact, check out impactus.org.